So this now advances our understanding of the history of North America by even greater leaps and bounds. I didn't think we'd ever get here, but lo and behold, language, indigenous history, red record, all these clues come together and I think present a rather compelling narrative. We have a now near comprehensive map for the origin and migration of Algic speakers, simply by taking what Native Americans, what they say seriously. Welcome, my name is Nathaniel Jeanson. This is the Lost History of North America, our next episode, and we've got a tremendous surprise in for you. I'm calling this a new account of the Algonquians from the Blackfoot to the Mohicans. This is going to cover a ton of discoveries I was hoping we'd be able to make one day. Didn't know if we would, and I hope you'll stick with us. Before I jump into that, though, I'm going to say this now, and I'll say it also at the end. If you're of First Nations descent, Native American descent, to get in touch with me directly, and I'll talk more about how you can participate in this going forward. Go to answersingenesis.org/go/traced. This URL down here at the bottom of the screen take you to a page that looks like this. There's a button you can click or just scroll down on this screen and you can enter your name, email, phone number if you want to. We put that in because we had contacts from some nations that it was easier to do phone than do email. This goes directly to my inbox. I've had a whole number of you contact me, which has been fantastic. I'll show you on the map here in a minute what it looked like. I have had some trouble once I get a message getting in touch with some of you, so I don't know if this is going to spam or if the phone gets routed to spam or something then too. I'll either be calling from a Kentucky number, because that's where I'm located in the office here, an 859 number, or if I call from my cell, it'll probably show up as a Boston number, because I spent a number of years there and have just retained my phone for over 10 years. Here's a map of what the Americas looked like in terms of language families at the time of European contact. I'm putting this up here because I want to show you just how many of you, how many different nations have been represented here in terms of reaching out to me from previous episodes. This is fantastic. I hope we can grow this even more. I haven't put a star for every single individual, so some of these nations have multiple individuals who've responded. So thank you very much. Thank you for sharing some of your history. I've heard a lot of stories, some very sad stories, which are tough to hear, which that's the way things have been for many Native Americans. So thank you for sharing those, and I hope even more of you will reach out and we're able to work through these questions of history together. Okay, now today's episode. Why would we call this a new account? Why do we need a new account for the Algonquians, which we're really going to talk about the entire Algic language family, Blackfoot, Mohicans, Shawnee, and so on. Why a new account? Because the old account that I learned growing up goes something like this. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, crosses the ocean, lands the New World. He's not the first, of course, from Europe, but he's the one who opens the floodgates of European settlement permanently. And then the history that I learned typically fast forwards to the first Thanksgiving, to the Pilgrims, 1620, 1621. Then it fast forwards again to the origin of the United States, 1776, the 13 colonies becoming a united nation. And then somewhere around this point, the history that I remember being taught begins to cover the peoples on the North American continent that these English settlers encountered. Now I say North America, I'm typically going to mean north of the Rio Grande. And of course, right now I'm heavily focusing on the United States, but we'll bring in Canada as well. So we talk about the Northeast tribes and nations, Massachusetts, Mohicans, Delaware, the Iroquois Confederacy. At some point we talk about the southeastern tribes, the Muskogeans, including the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, others, the Trail of Tears. At some point the United States acquires the Louisiana Purchase, and this brings us then out into the Great Plains and the nations and tribes that were located there. At some point, perhaps, we would eventually cover the nations in the Southwest, like the Navajos and Apaches, the Pueblo peoples. I can't recall at all us ever covering the California tribes or the Northwest Coast tribes. We may have, but it almost seemed like an afterthought. And what was missing from all of this, in addition to perhaps missing some of the tribes, was a history for these peoples. They were simply presented as, here's the peoples who were present. Here's what their cultures were like. But there was no narrative for their origins, their migrations, nothing like a history that I would learn for Europe. People, places, kingdoms, dates, events. If you turn to archaeology for answers, you'll find interesting observations. Yes, there were mound builders in what's now the United States, and you'll find archaeological descriptions of this with academic sounding names. This is a mound in West Virginia from the Adena era. Here's a mound closer to me. I'm in the sort of the upper part of northern Kentucky near Ohio, and so this is the Serpent Mound across the river, across the Ohio River in Ohio. Interesting, catches the eye. So does Cahokia, the greatest city north of the Rio Grande in the pre-Columbian era. One of the remnants of that city, this great mound here near St. Louis. But I think you'll also find the archaeological literature to be disappointing, and that's no knock to the archaeologists. You find names that, again, sound academic and don't have an obvious connection to the names we learn about, Anglos learn about, when learning the history of the United States. Where were the Iroquois or the Delaware or the Lakotas or some other name that we'd recognize? I've come to realize that part of the reason there's a gap between the nations that we hear about at the time of contact and the archaeological cultures that precede them is the fact that there was a tremendous amount of movement that we know occurred even post-contact. So think about, I'll call them a classic Plains Indian tribe. I feel like for many boys, perhaps, that's romanticized, cowboys and Indians, and it tends to be Plains Indians, the Oglala Sioux and others, Red Cloud's people. We typically think of them, or we learn about them, as being in the Dakotas area. Were they always in the Dakotas area? Well, we know that even going back to just the 1600s, they were once residents of what's now Minnesota. And they were pushed out of Minnesota due to pressure from another Siouan group, the Santee Sioux. The Santee Sioux were on the move because they were being pressured by neighbors to the north, the Ojibwa, who I think themselves were being pressured by Cree, who had required guns from some of the settlers around the Hudson Bay area. So there was this domino effect that eventually led to these Oglala Sioux being Plains Indian tribes. So if there's that much movement in just a century or two, I say a century or two because 1600s to the 1800s, when you think about the history of the Wild West, that amount of movement makes every careful archaeologist extremely hesitant to assign any label or national name that we'd recognize to archaeological sites. So this creates a gap. This is review if you've been with us last time, and I'm going to review a little bit more of what we covered in the previous episode and show you how you can watch it if you've missed it. We're going to have a playlist eventually for all these episodes. We're going to do many of them. There's a gap between pre-contact, pre-European contact archaeological sites and post-contact tribes that so many American school children learn about growing up. And this is the reason, I think, so much of the history of the pre-Columbian Americas has been a mystery. I spent years not knowing anything about it. Just knew these tribes, and they were people essentially without a history. So that's the first point. It's a review point. There's a gap that separates post-contact tribes and pre-contact archaeological sites. But the exciting news is that we began to uncover, as we've begun to close the gap with revolutionary discoveries. I'm going to mention this briefly again just by way of review. I'll come back to it at the end, but we're not going to focus on it as much in this episode. One of the main tools we've been using is genetics, and specifically an analysis of the male inherited DNA. The Y chromosome, males are XY, females are XX. The Y chromosome represents just a small fraction of the total. The reasons for focusing on this to the exclusion of other types of DNA are technical in nature, some of it having to do with statistical noise and how much can we confidently detect and so on, which I won't get into for sake of time. The basic principle, though, behind the Y chromosome inheritance is that it is passed on imperfectly. So I have 3 boys. I've passed on my Y chromosome to them, but it's happened imperfectly. On average, mistakes occur, and from published experiments where they compare dad's Y chromosome to son's Y chromosome, it's about 3 mistakes per generation. So if you compare mine to my boys, you should find 3 differences on average between me and each one of them. You'd find 3 differences between me and my dad's Y chromosome. So then you should find 6 differences, 3 plus 3, between my boys and their grandfather, my dad. You apply that principle globally to men around the globe. You quantify the differences. You plug in those DNA differences, Y chromosome differences into a computer program and say, give me a visual display of the differences, and what results, and this is an example from 600 Men, is something that looks like a family tree with branching structures and dates we can assign to the common ancestors and so on. This is an example of 600 men from around the globe, all the continents, various people groups, Africa, Europe, Asia, the Americas. There's Native Americans in this particular tree. This is from a 2020 study. Last time we covered the connection between one particular branch. These labels are semi-arbitrary, but there's a system to them, letters and numbers of the letters of the alphabet and numbers to designate which sub-branch and branch we're talking about. In this case, we're talking about haplogroup or branch C. Haplogroup is just the technical name. And there is a subset of Native Americans who belong to this. This particular lineage arrived in the Americas from Asia, Central Asia, Siberia area, came across about the 900s, and we showed evidence last time, strong evidence, I think, that this represents the arrival of the Algic language family, of which the Algonquian languages are a subset. Our main focus was the connection between that particular genetic lineage and one of the Algic language family members, the Delaware. I'll zoom in on this map here in a moment. And in particular, the Delaware account of their own origin. I've done episodes over a couple of years talking about this particular document. It's been rejected due to a thesis in the 1990s saying it was a forgery. What I've shown in times past is that if it's a forgery, it just so happened to anticipate genetic discoveries 2 centuries later, which I have a hard time believing a forger could see the future that far in advance and forge a document that matched what we now discover today. So my position is this is an authentic document, a history of the Delaware people. We mapped out, thanks to these genetic discoveries, with specific timestamps, the time of their arrival, the time and when their various locations. We mapped out their movement throughout North America, from Alaska down through Western Canada, across the Great Plains, across the Mississippi, and eventually to the Atlantic seaboard, where they encountered Europeans. We talked about one particular event. We connected the Delaware account to what I mentioned earlier, the greatest city north of the Rio Grande in the pre-Columbian era, Cahokia. We showed that there was a tremendous match between the timing of the Delaware arrival, their description of a battle around the Mississippi, and the known dates for the archaeological fall of Cahokia and migration southward. We even saw that the Red Record tells us the names of the leaders of the Delaware who were instrumental in overthrowing this great pre-Columbian North American civilization. That's all still review. Again, I'll point you to a place you can go to find that episode and see the details. I want to extend that today. You'll notice on this map, again, I'll zoom in so you can see it and highlight it this way. The Delaware at the time of contact represent just a small fraction of the larger Algic language family. So as big of an advance as what we discussed was, looking at this map, you can see how much more we have left to explain. So let's zoom in and see who all is represented here. The Algic language family includes tribes you may have never heard of if you're Anglo, Yurok and Wyots, who were on the northwestern coast of California at the time of European contact. For Anglos, other members of this language family might be more familiar, like the Blackfoot, perhaps the Cree. I'll come back to them in a minute because they covered such a broad area. That name I've probably mispronounced in times past. It's a French name. It's not Gros Ventre, it's Gros Ventre. That may or may not be familiar to you. Perhaps the Cheyenne, though, are one of the Great Plains tribes, the Arapaho. If we go further to the east, you'll begin to perhaps recognize these names. And if you recognize the names, but not because they're Native Americans, you'll quickly notice that there's a strong pattern of U.S. states being named after Indian tribes. So Miami, Illinois, Potawatomi. I grew up in Wisconsin, so we had a Potawatomi casino. That's a familiar name to me. Fox, Sauk, Shawnee. Of course, as we move to the east, there's Delaware. If you've read about the history of Virginia, the Jamestown settlement, the Powhatan Confederacy might be familiar to you. There's Algonquians there in the Carolinas. As we move up the coast, then, of course, there's Delaware. There's Mohicans and Mohegans. If you didn't know, there were actually two groups there were. There's Massachusetts, of course. I was 6 years in that state, named after an Indian nation. The Abenakis, the Micmacs, Passamaquoddies, and then to zoom out here so you can see just how much area the Cree and the Ojibwe covered. They were also members of this language family. I hope this gives you then a feel for just how much history is left to be uncovered. So many nations we didn't even touch in the previous episode. So what's their story? What's their history? I'd like to propose that we try to answer it in 3 steps. And it's going to get progressively more, I would argue, compelling as we go along. And I want to begin by doing something that we did in the last episode. Why don't we ask the Native Americans themselves what they say is their origin, where they came from? And what I want you to see here in the next few minutes as we go through some representative nations, it's not going to be every single one who's part of the Algic language family, in part because I don't know all the indigenous histories. So if you're part of one of these nations and I don't cover yours, would love to get in touch with you, would love to know what y'all say is the history of your migration. What I've been relying on primarily are 1800s era, early 1900s era ethnologies. So the U.S. government would send agents to these nations to document and say, okay, what do you all say is where you came from? What is your account of your history? What is your cultural practices? And that's where I've gleaned a lot of this history, but would love to know more. So again, I'll show you with language in a few minutes why I think these are representative examples and give us some tremendous clues. What I do want to say is, if you're listening to all this, and as I'm walking through these, and these initial clues don't sound that compelling, that was my reaction too. And I hope you'll stick with me, because I think you'll see how this explodes by the time we get to the end of this discussion. So let's start with the Blackfeet. This comes from an 1855 document, and a number of these, I'm going to put the references down here at the bottom of the screen, so if you're watching this, you can pause the video if you want to write it down. Almost all of these I think you can find for free online as PDFs. Archive.org has been a really helpful resource for me. So many of the copyrights are expired, so now it's free for anyone to see. Schoolcraft is the last name of this author, who was collecting information about the Indians, and many other Anglos who were among the Indians would write letters to him, tell them their observations, and so you find that in his work as well. And this is one of these examples. So D.D. Mitchell is the guy who's writing the into then to Schoolcraft, whose Schoolcraft is citing. So he says, during the 7 years I, Mitchell, spent among the Blackfeet, I frequently amused myself, and I will say at this point here, I'm going to quote them as they say it with whatever spelling they use and even with their biases. So this is going to sound derogatory, but hopefully what you'll see then, even though they may have had a derogatory attitude, they've documented some observations that are hugely helpful in understanding history of the Blackfeet, and we can put aside their biases, hopefully, and attitudes, and still be able to focus on what they documented. He says, I frequently amused myself by collecting such historical information as the old savans of the tribe had learned from their forefathers, together with their own recollections of more modern times. From all I could learn, the Blackfeet originally inhabited that region of country watered by the, and there's their spelling, Saskatchewan, we'd say Saskatchewan River, and its tributaries, which, if you're from the United States, you might say, where's that? It's in Canada. Here's, for reference, Montana, down here at the bottom of the screen. And then the Canadian provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And here's the north branch of the river, the south branch of the river. There it empties from west to east. So he said that the Blackfeet say they lived in that country watered by the Saskatchewan and its tributaries, never extending their hunting or war parties farther south than the headwaters of the Marias River or farther east than the headwaters of the Milk River. Which again, you may say, where's that? I would ask that question. Marias, you may not be able to read it. The main blue line here is the Missouri. It empties into the Mississippi, which has its headwaters in the Minnesota. Missouri is up this way further to the northwest. The Marias is right there. The Milk is right there. And you'll remember this is Montana, Alberta, Saskatchewan. The Saskatchewan River is further up this direction. So there you get a sense for the general region of where they say they came from. The cause of their separation and dispersion over a wider range of country grew out of a civil war regarding the claims of two ambitious chiefs, each claiming sovereign powers. And I'd also like to point out here that for sake of time, I can't quote all of these documents in full. I'm going to be extracting out segments and try to tell you when I've omitted stuff with these, with ... just so we can get the main crux of what's being said for sake of time. The warriors being divided enrolled themselves under the two banners, the younger and more warlike under the red, the old men contending for the hereditary claims of the Black Chief. And this is, you'll see here how they get their name, Blackfeet. After many skirmishes and assassinations, a pitched battle ensued which resulted in the disastrous defeat of the Black Chief. After the defeat of the Black Party, they fled towards the south, still marching under their black banner, and clothed in deep mourning. They appeared to have reached the Missouri during the fall, when the prairies were burning and the black ashes of the burnt grass had colored their moccasins and leggings. So what is burnt grass going to do? What color? In this condition, they were first seen by the Crow Indians, who called them the Blackfeet. And the Crows, of course, I don't have them on the map here, but they were out in this direction as well. The Blackfoot, in case you can't read it, is this shape right here. And the Saskatchewan River would have been right here. The upper reaches of the Milk and Marias right up here. And so the Blackfeet say they came slightly further to the east. That may not seem like a big clue. I'm going to highlight their homelands with this fuzzy green circle to show you it's an approximation. But we'll see in a few minutes that this is a extremely significant clue and a piece of a puzzle that, when you put them all together, becomes rather compelling. Now to the Cheyenne, who were right here. What do they say is their origin? This comes from George Bird Grinnell in 1923. The Cheyenne Indians, Their History and Way of Life, Volume 1. I've got the page numbers here as well, in case you want to look it up for yourself. Again, I'm summarizing because he's got a much longer section on this, just so you can get a flavor for what's being said. From the Cheyenne's own traditions, and from the fact that they are of the western Algonquians, whose current of migration was in a general westerly and southwesterly course, we may conclude that the Cheyenne came from the northeast or east, but whether they reached the upper drainage of the Mississippi River along the southern shores of the Great Lakes, and again, that's Minnesota, or along the northern shores and around the west end of Lake Superior, it would seem now impossible to learn. He's saying impossible, but don't miss the bigger point. He said we know they came from the east, and whether it was on the southern side, there we go, couldn't get my mouse to click, southern side of Lake Superior or more towards the northern side, okay, it's a small difference, but we know that they were encountered the Europeans out this way, but originally they came back from this way. We're now going to look at the Arapaho and the Gros Ventre and see that they say the same thing. The Arapaho, and sorry, just to point out then, so the Arapaho down here were neighbors of the Cheyenne, at least in this map. Again, this is Wikipedia because it's free. We'll have better maps in the future. These generally agree with what academic sources show. The Gros Ventre were right up here, neighbors of the Blackfoot, which that'll come up here in a moment. The Arapaho, along with their subtribe, the Gros Ventre, are one of the westernmost tribes of the wide-extending Algonquian stock. According to their oldest traditions, they formerly lived in northeastern Minnesota by the Cheyenne, and moved westward in company with the Cheyenne, who at that time lived in the Cheyenne Fork of the Red River. And if you say, where's the Red River? It's something I ask. I probably shouldn't have asked because I grew up in Wisconsin, but the Red River forms part of the western boundary of the state of Minnesota right here. So Arapaho, Gros Ventre are up in this area as well, next to the Cheyenne, migrating with them. From the earliest period, the two tribes have always been closely confederated, so that they have no recollection of a time when they were not allies. Interesting. In the westward migration, the Cheyenne took a more southerly direction toward the country of the Black Hills, and again, I'll show you on the map here, while the Arapaho continued more nearly westward up the Missouri. So if you're coming from Minnesota, Red River area, Black Hills will be down here, so yes, southwest direction in South Dakota, where they said that the Arapaho stayed more northwesterly along the Missouri. More details here. The Arapaho proper probably ascended on the southern side of the river, while the Gros Ventre went up the northern bank and finally drifted off toward the Blackfeet, with whom they have ever since been closely associated. So I said the Arapaho going this direction, they would have been the southern side of this Missouri River, the Gros Ventre up this way, and remember the Blackfoot were up this direction, Gros Ventre head up that way, and continue this now. Although they, the Gros Ventre, have on several occasions made long visits extending sometimes over several years to their southern relatives, by whom they are still regarded as part of the, and forgive my pronunciation, Inuaina. And I want to point out here as well, I know there's more to the Arapaho account after this fact and migrations back and forth. The main focus for this talk is on the earliest migrations. The others continued on to the Great Divide between the waters of the Missouri and those of the Columbia. I'll show you the map for that in a minute too. Then turning southward along the mountains, separated finally into two main divisions. Whereas the Columbia River up that direction. Remember again, this starts off Minnesota going this way,
The northern Arapaho, continuing to occupy the headstreams of the Missouri and the Yellowstone in Montana and Wyoming. So one group goes off this way. There's the Yellowstone here in Montana. They're now at this point in that area. While the southern Arapaho made their camps on the head of the Platte, the Arkansas, and the Canadian, in Colorado and the adjacent states, frequently joining the Comanche and the Kiowa in their raids far down into Mexico. The Arkansas River, right there, so that's a significant movement then to the south. So we can add this then to the growing picture of the homelands of these peoples before contact with Europeans. Arapaho again right here, neighbors of the Cheyenne. Gros Ventre right here, obscured by this green circle for the Blackfoot homelands. What we've just read says they came from Minnesota and were neighbors of the Cheyenne, migrated with them, it seems, briefly. What about the Cree, at least the Plains Cree? Now, one of the challenges, and I've had a member of the Cree Nation, a Cree contact, describe the history to me. One of the challenges for Canadian First Nations is the residential school systems, which led to, a couple generations ago, it being viewed, I'm told, natives and First Nations viewing themselves as negative, or it being negative to be identified as First Nations. And so many of the elders then stopped talking. And so some of the indigenous history has been lost. I'm hoping some of it is still preserved. So if you know of it and can get in touch with me, I would love to know it. What I've been able to only find so far, and I think probably a consequence of the ugly history of the residential schools programs, is a scattering of accounts right here from a later source. So you'll notice the Cree extend all the way from Alberta to the Atlantic, and the Plains Cree would have been the group over here. So this is a statement then, and I'm quoting here, this is a 2001 source, Handbook of North American Indians. It's a multi-volume, basically encyclopedia set. Multiple authors, Sturdivant is the editor, and they have a section on the Plains Cree, and I did find this. The Plains Cree, along with their Assiniboine allies, were the last tribe to move onto the plains in historic times. From where? Cree speakers moved west as a result of game depletion in the area east of Lake Winnipeg. And yes, for fellow U.S. citizens like me, I'll put on the map for you as well. Canadians probably know where this is. Resulting from the fur trade in the late 18th and early 19th century. So a late migration from east to west, from east of Lake Winnipeg. Where's that? Right here. So they would have moved from this direction that way. So we can, at a minimum, say at least one group of Cree arrived on the plains from a position that was further to the east. Okay, again, may not seem like a great clue, but it'll become clear here in a moment. What about the Ojibways? William Warren has written a history of their nation that I've seen cited on a number of different occasions. 1885, History of the Ojibwe Nation. Again, I'm summarizing because he's got a lot of detail here. In the previous chapter, or I should say I'm giving selective quotes because to give you the crux of what's relevant to our discussion. In the previous chapter, we have gradually traced the Ojibways from the Atlantic coast to their occupation of the shores, surrounding shores of Lake Superior. And here's where it gets even better. Computing their generations as consisting of 40 years each, it is 360 years since the main body of this tribe first reached point, and I'm not even going to pretend to pronounce that correctly, on the Great Lake. So he's writing in 1885, but the person he's talking about, or roughly the timing of when these observations were made, I think this was a guy talking to one of the Ojibwe chieftains or elders who was relating the account of their origins. So that's why I'm taking 1845 as the date and subtracting 360 years. You get about the 1400s. So we can add this then to the map. The Ojibways, again, covering up here by the St. Lawrence, all the way over to, it's covered by the map here, the green, I should say the green shading, again, up here into northeastern Minnesota, which you remember a few minutes ago I talked about Ojibways putting pressure on the Santees, put pressure on the Lakotas, and so on. They weren't originally there. That was a migration, apparently beginning perhaps in the 1400s, from the Atlantic westward over to the Great Lakes area, and then a dispersal further on. What about the Shawnee? Again, this is not comprehensive for every single group, but these will be critical clues and would be more than happy to learn more. This will all add to the account. Shawnees being down here. This is from Schoolcraft again, but the 1851 volume, part 1. and I'm again using their spelling, the Shawanoes, an Algonquin tribe, have a tradition of a foreign origin, or a landing from a sea voyage. The people of this nation, John Johnston, I'll talk about him in a minute, observes, have a tradition that their ancestors crossed the sea, which if you were with us in the last episode, that's exactly what the Delawares described. Or if you go, we even talked about this in 2020. I had a series of videos on human history and several episodes on Native Americans, and a whole episode just on the Red Record itself of the Delawares, and it describes them being in Asia, crossing the sea. And so I think this is also retained in Shawnee history as well. John Johnston, who was for many years their agent, so agent being a representative of the U.S. government interfacing between the tribes and the U.S. at that time. So John Johnston, prior to 1820, observes that they migrated from West Florida and parts adjacent to Ohio and Indiana, where this tribe was then located. So this particular map puts the Shawnee more in Kentucky and Tennessee. Other sources might put them a little bit further north to Ohio and Indiana. The point being, they had earlier been down in West Florida and had migrated north. Okay, so that's as far as I've been able to get in terms of indigenous histories. And I can think back months ago when I first started doing this, almost being a little disappointed because I was hoping for something as detailed as the Red Record and thought, okay, this isn't going to get us very far. But wait, what you'll soon see is these actually are quite consistent with other lines of evidence that pull the pieces together in a fantastic way. So I'm going to pause now the indigenous history for a moment. We'll come back to this map. We're going to add to this map. And I want to focus now on another discipline, linguistics, language comparisons among these various groups. And I'm going to turn to a leading authority on Native American languages, Lyle Campbell. I have his book, American Indian Languages, Historical Linguistics of Native America. And I'm going to show you a citation he gives to someone else about the Algic language family. I'm going to recolor code this map, obscure the names. You probably can't read it anyways at this level of zooming. I'm going to recolor code it so I can show you and highlight with colors the progression of time that is implied by the linguistic differences. I think I referred to this in the previous episode. The most divergent languages in this group are the Yurok and the Wyandotte out here on the west coast of California. What I'm going to show you a quote from refers to the other members of this language family, together known as the Algonquians. So just keep that in mind. These are the most divergent, likely broke away from the ancestor of the Algics first. The question then is, what about the rest of them? So here's the quote from Campbell's book from 1997. He cites Goddard, 1994. Goddard presents Algonquian as a west to east cline. There's some technical terms here which will become clear in a minute. Not of genetic subgroups, but of chronological layers, with the greatest time depth found in the west and shallowest in the east. So again, this discussion assumes already that these guys are the most divergent in the Algic language family, and the Algonquian subgroup of the Algic language family is everyone else here on the screen, highlighted with orange. So he presents this as a west to east cline, greatest time depth in the west, shallowest in the east. This is Algonquian. That is, each layer in his view is distinguished from those to the west by innovations and from those to the east by archaic retentions. Again, this will become clear in a minute. Where each wave of innovations is farther to the east, given the characteristic clinal configuration that reflects the general west to east movement of the family. It's technical linguistic jargon for you can compare all these languages to one another, quantify the differences, see what's happening. You can mark off the change with time, and it reveals a progression of splitting, basically, among this language grouping. And he gives the details here in a moment. It'll make more sense, I think, if I put it on the map. Blackfoot in the west is the most divergent. Again, most divergent of the Algonquian languages. It assumes already that we've recognized that these guys are the most divergent of the Algic family. So Blackfoot, he says, the most divergent right there. So he says Blackfoot in the west, the most divergent. Arapaho and Gros Ventre and Cree are the second oldest layers, which Cree would be this very large area up here, Gros Ventre right there, and then the Arapaho is right there. So he says that the next group to form, basically, the next oldest group would be these guys. I'm giving it the label level 3 because I'm thinking about the larger Algic family, not just the Algonquian subgroup. The next oldest includes, and I don't know why he repeats the Arapaho and the Cree, but he does. The next oldest includes the Cheyenne and Menominee. Cheyenne being the neighbors of the Arapaho right here. Menominee were up in the upper peninsula of Michigan and spilling over a bit into Wisconsin, or close to it. So that's the fourth layer. I'm calling it fourth. Next, he says, is the central or the core central Algonquian languages that would include Ojibwe up here, the Potawatomi, Fox, Sauk, Miami, Illinois, Shawnee. Next layer. And then he says the final layer is Eastern Algonquian, the only subgroup or layer that constitutes a valid subgroup. And I can underscore that by saying if you consult other sources, for example, if you, let's say you're a Christian and you have an interest in Bible translation, the Wycliffe Bible Translators might be a name or an organization that's familiar to you. They have an academic arm known as the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And they publish regularly a multi-volume set called the Ethnologue, where they are documenting the whole world of languages that exist on this planet, over 7,000. Classification, relationships, and so forth. They also treat Eastern Algonquian as a specific language subgroup that has underneath it a bunch of different languages. So that would be all these East Coast languages, including Delaware. I'm going to add a seventh layer because, yes, this is a valid subgroup. Then amongst themselves, Eastern Algonquin splits up into various language groups like Delaware, Abenaki, Micmac, and so forth. So that brief paragraph gives you a picture of what languages imply about the origin of these various subgroups. And what we've seen are fairly representative examples of the origin, according to indigenous accounts, of these various peoples. So we went to the Blackfoot. We had, of course, Arapaho, Gros Ventre, Cree accounts. We had a Cheyenne account. We had Shawnee. In the previous episode, we talked about the Delaware. So these major linguistic subgroups, we've also been able to identify what the peoples themselves have said about their origins. Again, this may not look like any sort of compelling history yet, but here's where it gets wild. If you were with us last time, you'll recall that, again, we talked about and mapped out the migration of the Delaware. According to the details written in the Red Record, we're able to put timestamps on all this. I want to put that migration path on the map that we just looked at. Now, the orientation of this base map with Alaska way up here in the upper left is a bit different from this one where Alaska's off the screen. So I'm going to have to bend that path a bit. To overlay it, it would look like this. And just seeing all this together might get the wheels turning in your head. You might ask yourself, could the Delaware Red Record actually be comprehensive for the entire Algic language family? Notice how geographically close a number of these groups or the homelands are to the path of the Delaware migration. What I want to show you now, and you can verify this for yourself, you don't have to take my word for it because you can find the Red Record online. Unfortunately, it seems to have gone out of print, but if you go to archive.org, it has, as I mentioned earlier, PDFs of books from 1800s where the copyrights expired, but it also acts like a library. So you can check out the ebook version of this Red Record that McCutcheon translated, David McCutcheon. I'd recommend that. You can create an account for free, really straightforward, and read the entire document on your own. What I want to show you is that in the Red Record, I think we can see that there were 7 distinct mentions where people groups separated off the main body. And I think if you then put those mentions on the map, you'll see the pieces come together beautifully. So let me set up the first split like this. Again, I don't have time to go through the entire Red Record, just extracts, the key separation events that I think are mentioning separation events. Let's fast forward in the Red Record to the time when they describe their crossing into the New World. They call it Akaman. So 10 times 1,000 they crossed, 10,000 people. All went forth in a night. They crossed to Akaman, the east land, crossing, marching, everyone together. And they mentioned who went. People of the north, the east, the south, of the eagle, of the beaver, of the wolf. So apparently 3 clans the hunters, shamans, headmen, women, daughters, animals. Beaver is going to come up here in a moment when I talk about the first split. So once they're in the New World, and again, I'm trying to show you when I've had to omit stanzas just to fast forward the narrative with those 3 dots. So once they're in the New World, they mention a series of about 96 sachems, leaders, and a brief description of some significant event while this sachem was in charge. After constantly on guard, that was his name of the sachem, the next sachem was Chilili, the snowbird, who spoke of the south, that our people would be able to grow and spread there. Southward went Chilili, eastward went the beaver. So it seems like one big chunk of the group, 1/3 of the group, went east. The other 2/3 with Chilili continued south. So this, I think, is the first split mentioned in the Red Record once they're in the New World, where a population, a subgroup, leaves the main body and goes elsewhere. And it goes on to describe where specifically. So the main group goes south to Akalaki, Snakeland, Southern Country, Tall Pine Country, Seashore Country. The Beaver Clan goes to Eastern Country, Fishing Country, Mountain Country, Game Herd Country. And if you read the Red Record, you'll see there's a number of geographic clues that help you be able to map out where exactly these groups went. The second split is one I'm still a little ambiguous in my own mind about. I'll tell you why I think this may be a bona fide split by reading the stanza before and then tell you the one that I think matters here. The next sachem, later on in the narrative, was Hominy Man, raising crops he began. The next sachem was the subdivider. These sachems were helpful. Nothing explicitly said that there was a population that moved away. You do wonder, why did this guy get the name subdivider? What or who was dividing? And I suspect it may have been a subpopulation of people. Why? If you look at McCutcheon's book, he gives the Red Record account 3 different ways. He gives you the English translation, which I'm quoting here, and I've got screenshots here then or page snippets to show you what it looks like in the book. He's got the transcription of the Delaware language itself, and he's got the pictograms that apparently formed the basis of the record when the Delawares had it generations prior. Notice that there's 2 pictograms here. If we look at how the Red Record describes the Hominy Man stanza, you notice the stanza in English, the next sachem was Hominy Man, raising crops he began. There's a single sachem. Then you've got the Delaware transcription, and you've got a single pictogram. 1 sachem, 1 pictogram. If you look at the stanza following subdivider, the next sachem was Shriveled Man, next sachem was Drought. You've got 2 different sachems mentioned, 2 different pictograms. So, before the stanza for subdivider, 1 sachem, 1 pictogram. After 2 sachems, 2 pictograms. This one has 1 sachem but 2 pictograms. So was there a second group that split off? I'm going to put a question mark here just because it doesn't seem obvious and explicit. But there's some clues that make me wonder if this was indeed a split. After Hardin one was the denouncer, rebellious and unwilling, in anger leaving eastward, some went away in secret. So this is the third split then, much more explicit. Clearly there's a group says bye-bye, goes eastward. I think that's much more straightforward. And it describes them remaining were the wise and prudent, the beloved one they made sachem. By the Yellow River they settled. So there's again geographic clues embedded in this narrative. Harvesting much from the wide meadows. Fourth split, again, is explicit. Eastward looking was the sachem, melancholy about the war there was. To the rising sun, to the east you must go, he said. Many were those who eastward went. Now, it's not entirely clear to me which group goes east, which stays behind. In other words, was the main body going east or the main body going behind? Because if you read on, it says they separated at the Mississippi. The lazy ones remained behind. Whatever it is, there's something happening at the Mississippi. We know where we are. Fourth split. And shortly thereafter, there's another split. This Little Cloud was the sachem once they crossed the Mississippi. Many were those who left the Nanacoats. So here's another new element to this narrative. Nanacoats and the Shawnee went to the Southland. You've seen in these previous stanzas, it just describes the split in general terms. Many were those who eastward went. It doesn't give you names per se. Here we have names, in a sense. I tend to think of Shawnee as a proper name. I can't read Delaware, but because McCutcheon has put the transcription of the Delaware in, I've been able to identify, okay, here's a word that he keeps translating south. Here's a word he keeps translating north. It appears that the word Shawa is the Delaware word for south. The Natticoats and the Shawnee went to that Shawa land. So it seems like they're initially simply described as the southward going people. And if you know Delaware, would love to speak to you, because I think there's even more clues embedded in this script that we haven't yet recognized. McCutcheon, I think, did a good job, but there's even more, I think, that as I've been trying to make sense of the Delaware language, makes sense because I don't speak it, there's some really other tantalizing things I don't have time to go into now that I would love to discuss further. But here's an explicit statement that there's a group that leaves and gives their names. So here's a fifth split, and one we can then identify specifically with a group. Great Beaver was the sachem at the White Salt Lick. Here's a mention of a split, but I don't think it's a population split. It just mentions one individual. The prophet, seer of heaven, went westward. But it sounds like this is just one guy, a community leader. He does mention, and it implies there are, again, people in the west, west of those left behind, west of those in the south, west visiting all there. So yes, there is a split, but I think it's one man leaving. I could be wrong, but it seems like it's one man, not a whole group. So I'm not counting this as a population split. Good inscribed, so sixth split now. Good inscribed was the sachem by the Great Falls, probably Niagara Falls. The eastern people, the Wolf people, moved east and north. Now, to this day, the Mohicans on their website say, we are the Wolf clan of the Delaware. So this may be then the origin of Mohicans. The seventh split is when the Delawares themselves break up into their individual divisions. Quite ready was the sachem by the shore, by the Atlantic. 3 were desired, so 3 were to be the divisions: the Unami tribe, the Munsee tribe, the Turkey tribe. And as best I can tell, this is all that the Red Record records, of movements of people from the main body. And what's intriguing to me is the number of splits has a very close correlation, a close correlation to the divisions, the number of divisions that we see linguistically. So let me take this a step further. There's this initial correlation, but I think we can do even better because we've been able to put a timestamp on the Red Record and the various sachems. And yes, there's assumptions built into these dates, but it's a good start. We can put timestamps and locations for each of these splits. It's not just that there are 7. That's interesting, especially when you compare it to the number of linguistic groups within Algonquian and Algic as a whole, if you include the Yurok and the Wyandotte. I can now say at this point on the map is when this group left. So watch. Let's go back through these splits. I'll put a date on it from last time. I have an exact year, but just realize that there's some uncertainty about the exactness of the year. It's around 941. So where does that put you on the map with this date? Here on the map, we mapped out that they were, from other clues, that the whole group was somewhere around up here. It's at that point that eastward goes the Beaver, but the main group then with Chilele goes south. Now bring in the linguistics. Here, according to the Red Record, is where one group breaks off. Based on linguistics and indigenous history, we said this is the most divergent of the Algic language family, this group right here. So if we put that first split, according to the Red Record, up here, could this be the Red Record's mention of the origin of these peoples down here? There's a distance between them. It's not an exact match. It says the Beaver went eastward. So if they went eastward, why would I connect them to a group down here? Well, if you read on in the Red Record, what happens after this group splits away? What happens to the group with Chilele, who went south? After Chilele, the sachem was Iamek, the Caesar. He slew them all. So 948, just whatever, a decade later, a few years later. After Iamek, 10 sachems, much evil was then south and eastward. And the Red Record doesn't even name the sachems. It's not clear to me if they were the ones doing the evil, or why their names are omitted. There's nothing else said about this. That's how bad the time was. So, given that time frame, covering 10 sachems, it would have been when the main body was around down here, much evil. The question I want to ask is, could that evil also have affected the beavers, the beaver clan that initially went eastward? Because the evil is also eastward and south. And could that have eventually led to their migration to the south and taking up residence in California at the time of European contact? Well, who could these people have fought with? If you look at who else is out there, that region of North America, the Athabascan language family would have been out that way. Now, the Navajos and the Apaches are also part of the Athabascan language family down here, but it's known that they would have migrated south. We'll come back to this in future episodes, hopefully, because the Delaware account, the Red Record, does mention them fighting North Walkers. That's the description, which makes me wonder if the Delawares in their migration eastward ran into the Navajos and the Apaches migrating south, and there was a battle, and they called them the North Walkers because they ran into their relatives up this way when they initially crossed over into the New World. So the Athabascans are there, sort of in that region, perhaps candidates for when there was this battle during these 10 sachems. Salish are also that direction. So if we superimpose where the Delawares were, that main body was at that time of the great evil eastward and southward, it's possible that this was a battle among these groups and could have led to the eventual migration south. There's still some mystery, but I think that's a reasonable working hypothesis for the moment, and definitely more we can explore going forward. I'll talk about that at the end. What about split number 2? Again, not entirely clear, not explicit that it's a split, but there are these pictogram clues that suggest perhaps the main group split in 2. The date here, 1103, allows us to put, based on the overall record, where exactly this split happened on the map. It's out this direction. Well, isn't that interesting that that split out this direction is right by the second linguistic split, the Blackfeet, who said their homeland was not so far from where this split would have occurred. That seems to fit. Delaware says implies there's a split. The date allows us to put it on the map. The map is very close to where the Blackfeet said their homeland was, and the Blackfeet are the next in line in terms of linguistic relatives, in terms of when the linguistic split happened. How interesting. It's an interesting correlation. What about the third split? We can put a date on that as well. An anger leaving eastward, it says. So in this case, I think it's clearer that the splinter group goes east, the main group stays behind. 1140 is the date. That puts them then, according to the overall time frame of the Red Record, right about there. Well, what's the third linguistic group, and where do they say they came from? The third linguistic group includes the Cree, the Gros Ventre, the Arapaho, the Plains Cree. Again, I haven't been able to find yet a ton of clues for Cree history. Implies some sort of migration from east to west, that homelands are further east. There's definitely explicit statements from the Arapaho and the Gros Ventre that they came from the area of Minnesota eastward of where the main body of the Delawares would have been at that time. Interesting. So this may be the origin of the Arapaho Cree Gros Ventre subgroup during the migration of the Delawares, which I think is appearing to be a description of the migration of the entire language family. 941-ish appears to be the origin of the Yurok and the Wyatt groups, and they eventually went south. Around 1100 seems to be the origin of the Blackfeet, perhaps if subdivider is describing a time of splitting group, and they end up out here. 1140 is when there's this group going eastward, and perhaps this is when the Gros Ventre, the Arapaho, the Cree as one group went eastward and ended up in Minnesota, and then later on they migrated back out westward. The fourth split in the Red Record, again, where I'm not entirely sure who goes east, who goes west, but it's around the time of the Mississippi, and the date here. So this is close to the time they overthrew Cahokia, 1243, separated at the Mississippi. Whichever group is going forward, whichever group is staying behind, again, we know that at least it's happening all around the Mississippi, this area right here. The fourth linguistic group is the Cheyenne and the Menominee, And again, the Cheyennes say they came from Minnesota. The headwaters of the Mississippi are in Minnesota. All this seems to fit. We can put a date on that. So this seems to be the origin of the Cheyenne and Menominee groups based on all these correlations among language, the indigenous histories, the Red Record, and all this together. Fifth split, in which the Shawnees are explicitly mentioned, 1376 is the rough date estimate. That allows us to put it somewhere on the map. This is after they've crossed the Mississippi. We know the Shawnees mentioned they came from down here, so it appears that this whole subgroup, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Fox, Sauk, Miami, Illinois, Shawnee, this perhaps was the time at which they split off. Yes, that Nanticokes are considered part of the Eastern Algonquin group, so I don't necessarily know what to do with that yet, but it seems at a minimum this lighter blue subgroup split off at this point from this direction. The Shawnee presumably then went south to Florida, western Florida. Ojibways presumably went east to the Atlantic. My guess is they reached the Atlantic before the Delawares did, though a different part of the Atlantic. And then the Ojibways later on migrated back to the west. And of course the Shawnees as well migrated back northward to the Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana area. That fits again. These differing lines of evidence seem to fit. That would be the date then for the origin of these subgroups. And by the way, remember that we had put the date for the migration back this direction, roughly the 1400s to late 1400s. So there's agreement there in terms of dates. They would have originated late 1300s, perhaps then reached the Atlantic, and then later 1400s turned around and come back this way. There's consistency. It fits. Sixth split, the Wolf people, which again we mentioned the Mohicans say we are the Wolf clan. They moved east and north. This is 1465. It gets us very close to the Atlantic seaboard, which of course the Mohicans are right out this way at the time of contact. So the origin would be when the whole group is out here. That fits, makes sense. So the sixth subgroup right there, 1465. And then the last division, of course, within the Delaware community itself, splitting up to various groups. This is when they're at the shore, at the Atlantic, and you form the various subgroups of Delaware, along with, I think, probably somewhere in this sixth, maybe the fifth, sixth, seventh split, you have the splitting up of the Eastern Algonquian subgroup as well. So this now advances our understanding of the history of North America by even greater leaps and bounds. I didn't think we'd ever get here, but lo and behold, language, indigenous history, Red Record, all these clues come together and I think present a rather compelling narrative. We have a now near comprehensive map for the origin and migration of Algic speakers, due in large part simply by taking what First Nations, Native Americans, what they say seriously. These are not, unfortunately, it seems like the mainstream community often treats Native history, Native Americans as dumb, as if they didn't know what they were doing. You read these indigenous accounts, the ethnologists who are going to them saying, look, they kept records. It may not be written records like we're used to seeing with alphabets, but they've got a stick with notches on it, and the elder can tell you this is what happened at this date and this many generations ago. They've got this on a string, and we'll get into more groups that have these sorts of accounts in future episodes, like the Sioux and Catawban. In the next episode, we'll likely talk about who were the people who built Cahokia that the Delaware, or the main body of Algic speakers, eventually overthrew. There's an enormous amount of history still out there that sadly has been marginalized or outright rejected, treated as mythological or forgeries even. Yet when we start taking it seriously and bringing it together with linguistic clues, with genetic clues, we didn't talk as much about genetics today, but it's in the background because it sets the temporal framework for the Red Record. And that temporal framework is consistent with other temporal frameworks from indigenous history, with the general direction with the linguistics. I think this makes for a very compelling case. And as these clues begin to come together, it's going to open up even more answers. Why? I alluded to one earlier. The Red Record mentions enemies, like North Walkers, whoever they are. And again, there's even more fascinating linguistic clues in the Red Record. McCutcheon, the translator, I think, does a good job taking a stab at what he thinks the words mean. You know, we went east and we went into this river. We encountered this river, and he says, well, I think it's the Ohio. Or we went to encounter these mountains. I think it's the Alleghenies. What appears to be stated in the Red Record is if you remember from previous episode, they called the rulers of the Mississippi the Telegas, the builders of Cahokia. They call the river, basically, it appears to me, the Telega River, the Telega Mountains, which makes sense. It's very descriptive and evocative language. Think if the United States today invaded Mexico, but we had never been to Mexico. You'd probably cross the Rio Grande and say, oh, now we're in the Mexican desert. And oh, now we're crossing the Mexican River. And those are the Mexican mountains, for lack of a better term, because this is your first time there. So even if you read the, again, I can't read the language itself, but just trying to glean clues from it, there's some fascinating descriptions as they're moving eastward of who they encounter. And again, there's enemies. McCutcheon tries to translate, takes a guess at this is Wyandots, these are Iroquois. The actual words might be something else, and I think there's clues there that are worth exploring further. Again, if you are a speaker or know the language, we'd love to talk to you more, because I think there's more to be gleaned. And this is going to start identifying for us, oh, maybe this was actually the Siouans, or that was the Cherokees, or who knows. But there's clues there. There's a lot more yet to be discovered. So this is so that's my second point then. We have a near comprehensive map for the origin and migration of Algic speakers. It's really, though, an outline. It's a framework. It's not exhaustive. Comprehensive, but not exhaustive. For example, yes, this is a busy map. I've spoken to a couple of you, I think, of Blackfoot ancestry or connected to the Blackfoot, and you've mentioned to me, hey, we used to go down to Mexico. That's a detail I didn't put on this map yet, but it's one example of likely all sorts of history that's still yet to be gleaned or recovered, and there's ways to do it. One of the ways I want to point out, partly because this is my background, expertise, I'm not a linguist, so I don't have the skills to dig into the Delaware language itself. This family tree, if you were with us previous episode, anchored the Delaware narrative. There were some clues and dots we could connect. What I'll show you in future episodes, I think we've got a good genetic candidate for the Athabascans, the Navajos in particular. But this is a field, I think, that's ripe for further exploration. And this is one of the projects we're trying to pursue at present. A number of you have already responded. What we're looking for going forward in terms of, so if you're of First Nations or Native American descent, there's a huge amount of potential, number one, in Indigenous histories. I'm sure I'm far from exhausting the Indigenous histories that are out there, so please point me in the right direction, or if you have Indigenous histories, would love to know it, because I think there's a lot we can recover. That's one area, more Indigenous histories. The second area, of course, is linguistics, especially with the Red Record if you speak Delaware, because there's clues I can't access not speaking the language. Thirdly, with genetics itself. So if there's within this field of genetics, there's two subgroups of people, two ways you can help, I think. So if you're a male, any tribe. I've been focusing on the Algic, but you'll see in future episodes we'll talk about Siouan, Catawban, Athabascan. I'm going to cover as much of North America, north of the Rio Grande, as I can. So this is a very broad project. If you're a male, where your paternal ancestry is Native, you would be a good candidate. We're looking for about 100, 150 volunteers. I've got a verbal agreement with the retired CEO of Family Tree DNA, who said there's a way we can do it to protect the privacy of the participants, where I'm the only one who's got the personal information. All the company gets is tubes with numbers. I think it's just like a cheek swab. And then I get the information back and then can share it with the participants to protect the privacy, keep big tech, big genetic companies from having all that. And there's a way I have some research monies too I can spend on this. We're not a government organization. We're a Christian organization, nonprofit. We have monies. We can pay for it if you can't afford it. We have monies. We could probably pay for all the volunteers, but I like to see this as a collaboration where we work together to try to recover the history. So that's one group in the field of genetics, a small subgroup. The much larger group, though, is male or female, any nation. I call them advocates. So there's going to be a whole process, if we're able to do the genetics, of getting volunteers. We're going to have our own institutional review board. We're going to need members from each of your nations to give input into the ethics side. Okay, if we want to get informed consent, what's the culturally appropriate way to do so? We're not interested in ticking people off or doing things offensive. And there will also be a step where we need to get the approval of the institutional review boards of each nation. And my impression is, I'm a Caucasian descent, so I don't know that my chances of getting approval are that high. But if there's enough of a community that says, no, we're Native American, we want to know the answer, my guess is the success of that project moving forward will go up. So would love to hear from any Native Americans, First Nations descent, if you want to participate, or just say, hey, I like this project, keep going. That's all very encouraging. Like I said, we've had 15 to 20 different nations, I think, already respond, a number of individuals from, and around that number, I think, of individuals or more who've responded, some male, some female. We've got a number of candidates already who say, I know I have a male Native or First Nation descent. I'm of this tribe. Fantastic. It's just a verbal commitment at this point. We have to wait till we're about up to 100 verbal commitments before we can order the kits. Part of that's because then we get a price discount. So I'd like to get that. It's expensive. Once again, the way to get in touch with me directly, you go to answersandgenesis.org/go/traced. There's a button you can click, or you simply scroll down to the bottom where you can enter your name and email, phone number. I might call you directly, either from an office phone that'll be an 859 number, or my cell phone, it'll be a Boston number, or email you, check spam, because there's been a small group who've messaged. I haven't been able to get in touch, again, maybe because it's going to spam. This is all research that's been growing out of a book I published that summarizes the global history of humanity. It came out in March of 2022, traced Human DNA's Big Surprise. We did a multi-part series on this last year and spilling over into this year. The episode that I kept referring to about the red record and connecting it to genetics is actually in this series. We're also going to put that episode in a new playlist that we're probably going to call something like The Lost History of North America. So if you go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, there is this playlist where you can still find that previous episode, but we're also going to put a new playlist where we collect this series, and there's going to be more episodes in this series, on the lost history of North America. Now, I did refer to the Red Record as something I did a couple of years ago as well. There is yet another playlist series called The New History of the Human Race. Again, Answers in Genesis YouTube channel. There's this playlist, there's the Traced playlist, and there's going to be a Lost History of North America playlist that collects this episode, the previous episode, and episodes for the future that we're going to do going forward. I've also published other books. This of course, is within a non-mainstream framework, naturally, that disagrees with evolution. I've published my reasons for why I do that, scientific reasons, in this book called Replacing Darwin. There's a sort of a Cliff Notes version of this, just a 100-page booklet called Replacing Darwin Made Simple. Or if you prefer videos, there's a 1-hour lecture we have on DVD. You can also go to our streaming service, answers.tv. I'm part of the organization that has the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter here in northern Kentucky. Come visit us, life-sized replica of this, and you see within this research all these various genetic branches going back to known as family. That's something it's an observable scientific fact. You can find me as well on the various social media platforms, which I've contacted people that way as well. That's part of the reason I set these up, is to simply make conversation easier. Yes, on Facebook and Twitter, but also a number of these other alternative accounts, simply because I don't know when I'm going to get kicked off Facebook or Twitter. So find me there as well. Or again, answersandgenesis.org/go/trace to go directly to my email inbox, and we can correspond that way as well. Thank you so much for your interest in this. Thank you again to all the Native Americans and First Nations who have already contacted me. I'm really excited about where this project can go, excited about what we found so far. Stay with us for future episodes. There's even more coming. Thank you again. See you then.